In the year 6420, a return survey team opened a sealed apartment and found a black rectangle beside the bed. It was cracked, silent, and facing upward, as if it had been waiting 4,000 years for one last touch. The first complete specimen came from a collapsed coastal apartment block, 30 meters below a restored forest canopy. The building had been sealed by flood sediment, plastic ash, and concrete dust during the late fragmentation. Most of the furniture had dissolved into stains. Metal frames remained. Ceramic fragments remained. A few personal objects remained where hands had left them. On the right side of the sleeping platform, beneath a thin crust of gray dust, the survey team found a small plate of black glass. It was rectangular, rounded at the corners, and broken across the face. The back carried no useful inscription. The front reflected the lamps of the return team with such clarity that, for a moment, the object seemed less excavated than awake. The discovery would not have mattered if it had been rare, but the same object kept appearing. Beside beds, in vehicles, near eating surfaces, inside schools, in office towers, in clothing pockets, in grave contexts. Some were wrapped in protective shells, some were still connected to dead cables, some had shattered so violently that the glass had become black sand. The Institute called the class black mirrors before it understood them. The name was wrong in the technical sense. It was accurate in every other sense. The objects were small mirrors that did not simply show a face. They had once shown a life. The black mirror problem began with abundance. Archaeologists are trained to read rarity. A crown, a weapon, a temple, a tomb, or a monument announces itself as important. The black mirrors did the opposite. They were so common that early teams almost treated them as background debris. In one residential sector, investigators counted more black glass plates than cooking vessels. In a transit corridor, they found them under seats and in drainage channels. In a school complex, they appeared in lockers and backpacks. In a hospital wing, several were recovered beside beds, on the floor beneath chairs, and in one case pressed under the body outline of a patient who had never been moved. The pattern did not match a simple tool. It did not belong only to workers, soldiers, priests, children, elites, or the sick. It crossed age, class, region, language, and building type. The object seemed to follow the person rather than the profession. That made it hard to explain. Ancient people often describe special objects because special objects need explanation, but ordinary objects vanish into silence. Later humans wrote manuals for machines and terms of service for invisible systems, yet very few texts explained what it felt like to live beside a phone because everyone already knew. 4,000 years later, that shared understanding was gone. The Institute had millions of artifacts and almost no context. The most intimate object in the human layer had become one of its least self-explanatory clues. The earliest formal classification described black mirrors as devotional identity tablets. This is usually mocked in later training lectures, but the theory was not foolish. The evidence pointed in that direction. Later humans carried the objects close to the body. They touched the glass with repeated thumb motions. Chemical traces showed skin oil, sweat, cosmetics, food residue, and environmental dust pressed into the surface. The devices appeared beside sleeping places and at thresholds between private and public life. Some were placed in graves with jewelry, keys, toys, and other personal effects. The mirrored face suggested ritual. The repeated gestures suggested habit. The protective cases suggested value. The way the object was carried everywhere suggested dependency. To future scholars, the black mirror looked like a portable proof of self, a small surface through which a person confirmed who they were before entering the day. One paper proposed that the user looked into the dark screen as part of a mourning identity rite. Another argued that the object displayed social rank inside a distributed caste system. A third suggested it was a pocket shrine, not to a god, but to the self. All three interpretations were wrong, but each approached a truth from the wrong century. The phone was not sacred in the formal sense. It had no priesthood, no altar, no fixed liturgy. Yet it shaped attention, memory, desire, status, loneliness, and the idea of the self so deeply that future archaeologists were right to look for religion in its shadow. The case changed when a preservation lab recovered partial data from a cluster of damaged devices found in a sealed transit locker. Most files were unreadable. Some were corrupted beyond recognition. Others opened only as fragments, contact names without voices, images without dates, messages without the conversation that made them meaningful. Still, the fragments were enough. The black mirror was a smartphone, a communication device, camera, map, bank, market, calendar, theater, library, workplace, gaming machine, identity token, and memory container compressed into a surface smaller than a hand. This discovery forced the Institute to reinterpret hundreds of sites. A bedroom was no longer only a sleeping chamber if a person could bring work, strangers, entertainment, news, arguments, surveillance, and desire into it through the glass. A vehicle was no longer only transport if the passengers were also writing, watching, buying, navigating, recording, or fighting somewhere else. A public square was no longer fully public if each person carried a private door into a different crowd. The most surprising data was not technical, it was emotional. The devices held birthdays, apologies, receipts, medical alerts, love messages, search histories, lost photographs, blocked numbers, and unfinished notes. They preserved the tiny administrative movements of a life. The Institute stopped treating the black mirror as a single-purpose artifact. It was not a thing people used. It was a place they entered. Once the smartphone was understood as a pocket world, the human layer began to look different. Future students often ask why layer humans continued building cities if so much of their social life happened through screens. The answer is that the screen did not replace the city. It folded the city into the person. A map no longer lived on a wall or in a vehicle. It lived in the hand. A market no longer required a street. It lived in the hand. A bank, a theater, a workplace, a family album, a newspaper, a prayer list, a dating hall, a school, and a crowd could all open from the same dark rectangle. This was the miracle, and the wound. The device made distance collapse. A person could speak across oceans, find directions in an unknown district, translate a sign, call for help, preserve a child's face, or learn almost anything from almost anywhere. It was one of the most powerful personal tools ever built by the screen-age civilization. But the pocket world also meant there was no clean edge between here and elsewhere. Work followed people into beds. Fear followed people into meals. Strangers followed people into private rooms. Public judgment arrived in the palm of the hand. The object gave layer humans extraordinary reach, then made reach feel ordinary. That is why the Institute's later reports avoid calling the phone merely useful. It was useful. But it also changed the shape of presence. It taught bodies to sit in one place while attention lived in another. The next discovery was harder to explain to recovery-age students. The black mirrors were not passive containers. They summoned their owners. Recovered interface fragments showed icons, counters, colored signals, vibration patterns, sound alerts, infinite scrolling feeds, and short moving images designed to return the eye to the glass. The phone was a tool, but around it grew an economy that treated human attention as extractable material. The Institute named this system the attention engine. It was not one company, one platform, or one machine. It was a civilization-scale arrangement in which communication, entertainment, advertising, status, and surveillance braided together. The engine learned what people paused on. It learned what angered them. It learned what they wanted, what they feared, what they compared themselves against, and when they were most likely to come back. This is where the black mirror becomes more than an artifact of convenience. It was a behavioral environment. Layer humans did not only choose to look, they were invited, measured, interrupted, and rewarded for looking. Future archaeologists are careful here. They do not describe layer humans as weak. They describe them as targeted. The device arrived as a servant, then became a doorway, then became a schedule, then became a market for the seconds between one thought and the next. The most fragile resource in the human layer may not have been oil, water, or lithium. It may have been the human moment before a choice. The black mirror was not only a machine for receiving the world, it was a machine for being witnessed by it. Recovered social fragments show faces framed for approval, meals photographed before eating, locations marked for memory, bodies measured for display, grief posted into public space, and ordinary days edited into sequences meant to be seen. To the Institute, these records first looked vain. Later, the interpretation became more humane. Layer humans lived in networks where visibility could feel like existence. To be seen was not always shallow. It could mean belonging, safety, opportunity, desire, proof, or rescue from loneliness. A message read by one person could change a day. A photograph liked by many could confirm a version of the self. A silence could become a wound. The phone made identity portable, editable, and exposed. It allowed people to become authors of their own image, but also forced them to manage that image under constant comparison. It made memory easier to preserve and harder to escape. This is why future scholars rejected the simple phrase social media addiction. It was too small. The black mirror did not only provide pleasure. It provided contact, status, archive, performance, evidence, and fear of disappearance. In the older sacred theory, researchers had imagined a mirror in which layer humans worshipped themselves. The later evidence was sadder and more intimate. Many were not worshipping. They were asking whether anyone was still looking back. By the time of the return surveys, the networks were gone. Satellites had fallen or been replaced beyond recognition. Data centers had flooded, burned, been stripped, or become inaccessible inside closed zones. File formats were lost. Encryption keys were missing. Cloud archives had decayed into mathematical fog. The phone remained, but the world inside it had collapsed. This is one reason the black mirrors are so haunting in museum reconstructions. The artifact itself is often intact enough to hold, but its meaning depended on systems too large to fit in a display case. Towers, cables, satellites, battery supply chains, app stores, banks, identity systems, advertising exchanges, social graphs, and billions of other users. A single phone was never single. It was the visible end of a planetary machine. Future archaeologists can recover pieces of that machine, but not the living pressure of it. They can read a notification log without feeling the pulse in the wrist. They can translate a message without knowing the silence before it arrived. They can reconstruct a feed without feeling what it meant to lose an hour inside it. The black mirror therefore teaches a difficult archaeological lesson. Some artifacts do not die when they break. They die when the shared world around them disappears. What remains is a shell of intimacy: glass, metal, lithium, rare earth elements, fingerprints, and the faint possibility that someone once held the object while waiting for an answer. Later Institute reports include a section called Errors of Interpretation. It is not an apology. It is a warning to future researchers. The first teams thought black mirrors were religious tablets because they underestimated how much ordinary life can resemble ritual. They thought the object was a status token because they saw protective cases, brand variation, and display culture, but missed convenience and dependency. They thought the dark screen reflected only the self, when in fact it had once reflected everyone else. Yet each era revealed something true. The phone did carry identity. It did structure ritual. It did signal status. It did create private devotion. It did accompany sleep, waking, eating, travel, work, flirtation, anger, boredom, grief, and waiting. The deeper mistake was not that future archaeologists made the object too strange. It was that later humans had made the strange feel normal. That is the central method of human layer studies. Look at an ordinary object until it becomes archaeological. Then look again until it becomes human. The Black Mirror was a tool built by a technical civilization. It was also a daily companion, a behavior field, a memory vault, a market gate, a loneliness machine, a rescue device, a camera, a confession booth, and a crowd. No single interpretation is large enough. That is why the object matters. It carried too much of the civilization in too little space. The final display in the Ancestral Earth Archive does not show a restored phone glowing with reconstructed data. It shows a dead one. The specimen is cracked across the glass. Dust has collected in the fracture lines. The metal edge is bent. The back is scratched by years of contact with keys, tables, pockets, pavement, and hands. It is displayed face up, the way it was found, beside a label that reads, Personal Network Device, Screen Age, Probable Daily Use Object. The label is accurate. It is also inadequate. A daily use object can be the most revealing artifact a civilization leaves behind, not because it explains everything, but because it was present when everything happened. It was there for work and boredom, love and jealousy, emergencies and jokes, insomnia and maps, births and deaths, private photographs and public disasters. It was there when people reached for connection, and when connection became too much to bear. Later humans recorded almost everything, yet their most common object became silent. Its glass no longer lights. Its passwords are gone. Its voices are gone. Its networks are gone. Still, in thousands of sites, black mirrors were found facing upward. That small detail appears again and again in the field notes. Facing upward beside the bed. Facing upward in the vehicle. Facing upward under a school desk. Facing upward in the dark. As if the object had not been abandoned. As if it had been waiting.